I'm Sheri Byrne-Haber. I am a senior staff accessibility architect for VMware. We have slightly strange titles. Senior staff actually means I'm at the senior director level. And so I do a lot of work with accessibility outreach and strategy. Some of you may know me from my blog or from the work that I do with W3C. Or in my previous role, setting up the accessibility program for McDonald's. So I'm here today to talk about shift left. What does it mean? Why is it important? How to do it? And I'm going to start with an introduction and 3 semi-controversial statements, and then talk about why to shift left, basically a cookbook for how to sell it to your management, and then things that you can look at that will result in you doing accessibility better and earlier in your product development processes. Okay, so who am I? Started off with a degree in computer science, actually spent a decade working in functional and performance software testing before to go to law school. I got involved with some expert witness work that was about whether or not some software had been adequately tested. Keep in mind, this was long before accessibility was of public conversation. And I realized that the programmers didn't understand the law, the lawyers didn't understand technology, and there ought to be an interesting career, because I was getting a little bit bored, for somebody who knew both. And so I went to law school thinking that I was going to do intellectual property, of course. And my 3rd year of law school, we discovered that my middle daughter was losing her hearing. So people automatically assume, because they see me use a wheelchair, that I got into accessibility because of my own disabilities. But in fact, I got into it because of my daughter's. I did, because I'm totally overeducated, throw in an MBA along the way. So I can speak about accessibility from the business side, from the legal side, and from the computer side, and as a person with a lived experience of having a disability. And so I think I see all angles of this issue and can tailor the conversation accordingly to those audiences. All right, so controversial statement number 1. Accessibility QA is at its core a specialized form of regulatory testing. Yes, we want to do the right thing for people with disabilities. Yes, we want to be inclusive. But when you're looking at how to structure it within an organization, chances are that you're going to have a regulatory testing process already in place. You're going to have privacy testing. You're going to have security testing. It's already going to be fairly well established. And the controversial statement number 2, accessibility is kind of the forgotten stepchild of regulatory compliance. Nobody releases software that's not secure, or they try not to. They don't intentionally do it anyways. People don't release software that doesn't guarantee privacy concerns in GDPR, because they know they'll get their asses handed to them in court if somebody wants to litigate for that. But people release software that's inaccessible all the time. And so that's why I call it the forgotten child of regulatory compliance. So if your company has a good privacy and security process, you definitely want to latch on to the coattails, because what you're doing is you're taking the structure, you're taking the framework, and you're pulling out one set of regulations and you're putting another set of regulations in. Yes, it's more inclusive. Yes, it's the right thing to do. But at the end of the day, does it matter why it gets done, or does it matter that it gets done? And to me, it definitely matters more that it gets done than why it gets done. Okay, and then controversial statement number 3 is, what does shift left mean? Some people interpret shift left as, oh my gosh, I've got to take my accessibility thought from the end and make it the very first thing I do. Shift it all the more of a progress over perfection girl. And I think if you've taken a step that prevents something bad from happening, you find something and fix it earlier in the process before the customer finds it, then you have successfully shifted left. So we're looking at just taking little microscopic steps, saying, well, instead of that release, let's do it here. And then instead of where you are in testing, let's do it in coding. Instead of coding, let's do it in design. So you're basically walking your way back up to getting accessibility considered as early in the process as possible and making sure that it's part of the definition of done. Okay. So why to shift left? I mean, I've already hinted at some of this already, so you probably won't be surprised. Most people look at the software development cycle like this, which is you've got a requirements phase, which then leads to a feasibility stage that then goes to where it gets architected. You then actually get into the coding, then you do the testing, then you do the deployment. So shift left takes these numbers, and number 6 is obviously not the place that you want to, which is deployment, is not the place where you want to be finding accessibility problems, and helps you find them earlier in the process. So it reduces cost because you're backing it up to an earlier phase. If you can find it earlier, it's going to be better, easier, and cheaper to fix. It's also going to be lower risk because if you're finding it at the deployment stage, you're risking your release state. If you're finding it at the feasibility stage, you're preventing the problem from ever happening. And the cheapest bug to fix is always the one that never got introduced. Okay, so shift left requires analysis of accessibility earlier in the software development process. That's the basic definition. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to go gung-ho and go, well, we're finding all of our problems in phase 6 and we want to find them in phase 1. Do it in small bite-sized chunks because that way people will be able to absorb the change more easily over time. Okay, so there's something in software called the rule of 10. And the rule of 10 looks like this. You have a product. The product has some sort of requirements phase, then it has a design phase, then it has a coding phase, and these concentric circles are getting larger and larger because more and more people are involved with each phase over time. And when you have more people involved, it's obviously going to be more expensive. Then you've got your testing phase, then you've got your production phase. For every dollar that is spent in the requirements phase, so the very first phase after the product has been conceptualized, if you find a bug, if you spend $1 there to prevent a bug from happening, if you didn't find it until design, the same dollar would cost you $10. If you didn't find it until coding, the same dollar would cost you $100. Testing is $1,000, production is $10,000. Now you might look at that and you think, well, $10,000, a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, especially not for larger companies. But this is, remember, it starts with $1. Whoever spends $1 to solve anything in the requirements phase. If you have somebody spending, let's say half an hour to prevent a problem from happening in accessibility from getting out to production, you probably spent $75, which means you probably saved $75,000 from that bug being found in production. Okay, so most accessibility testing is done in testing and production, which are the two most expensive phases to do it at all. So by pushing accessibility back into design and coding, you're going to reduce your accessibility costs in testing and production. So how does that work? Well, this is the way most people do it right now. They make a large investment in accessibility audits and reviews prior to release. And maybe the bugs get fixed before release, and maybe they don't. Maybe they require a second release to fix the bugs. Releases are expensive, lots of human time involved. Customers have to upgrade. That makes customers unhappy because maybe they have to take the system down to upgrade it. So instead, what shift left tells you to do, instead of making a large investment at release time, is go through backlog design, coding, and testing, and make small investments in accessibility at each of those stages. Because when you do that, you're taking your huge investment that's high risk at the release stage, and you're turning that into a small investment, and there's no longer as much risk. So the sum of small investments, sorry, I went by that fast. So the sum of the small investments that you make is going to be cheaper and lower risk than that huge investment that you were making only at release time. All right, so hopefully I've convinced you all to join the shift left bandwagon for accessibility. Now I'm going to talk to you about things that you can look at in each of these 6 phases and how to go ahead getting those implemented. So first of all, gotta debunk some accessibility myths. I'm not saying you guys believe these. You're smart enough to be on this call, so you probably don't believe these things. But trust me, these are myths that are going to be pervasive in your organization that you're going to have to work around in order to convince people to change the way that they're doing things. So myth number 1: accessibility is a technical thing. Leave it to the techies. So everybody has a role to play in accessibility, all the way down to DEI, HR, and procurement, because the best way to get something accessible is to have people talking about accessibility all the time that aren't on the accessibility team. How do you do that? You employ more people with disabilities. How do you employ more people with disabilities? Well, yeah. Disability employee resource groups, you have good disability related benefits, you have a good accommodations program. So all of those things factor into how good your accessibility program is. But those people have nothing to do with product accessibility directly. So it's really important to understand that absolutely everybody has a role to play in making products and services accessible. So myth number two, all that's required to be a good accessibility tester is to know how to use assistive technology. You guys probably already know this, but you need testers with disabilities or testers who understand in depth the lived experience of people with disabilities who can emulate that as they're doing testing. You know, having spent 45 minutes to learn voiceover or NVDA is not going to be sufficient to convey the experience of a blind individual and how they consume a page and how they experience barriers and work around them. You really need to understand these things to be good at accessibility testing. So with that in mind, I am now going to do a deep dive on the 6 different areas. So things that you could do to shift left accessibility in the requirement stage. Number 1, do your personas have disabilities? Okay. Most software companies have personas, and personas are these pretend users that are common to software use. So if I was at the University of Utah doing software, I would probably have a persona that's a grad student. You know, you have a grad student, they just started the graduate program, they came from another college, you build up this personality around this user that is going to drive how they might use the software that's given to them at the University of Utah. So make that persona dyslexic, make that persona have carpal tunnel syndrome, give that persona migraines, so that you get disability integrated into your personas. It's really important. If you were just going to pick one, I would say color blindness would be the one to start with, because it's one of the most common disabilities, especially in male-dominated areas, because it's an X-linked inheritance pattern. That's always a good one to start with, because you're guaranteed that probably somebody working on your project, whether or not you know it, is colorblind. 6.5% of people who work in IT are colorblind. Okay, has the product owner consulted with people with disabilities or lived experience with assistive technology? Okay. So the product owner, they're a business person. Typically, they're the ones that are deciding what features go in, what features are left out, when the release dates are, and all of the things that are associated with taking all the pieces of the product and packaging it together to then put it out to the end consumers. Okay, if that product owner doesn't understand accessibility, at least at a high level, chances are accessibility is not going to be included as part of the definition of done, and not enough time is going to be allocated for accessibility related reviews and testing. So that's pretty critical for shift left. In order to successfully shift left, your product owner has to be consulting with this group of people. And it can be in the accessibility team. It can be through outside user research. It can be with a nonprofit. There's a lot of different ways product owners can get this experience. They can pick whatever works best for them. Okay. Will the product have any functionality that's going to be, let's, for lack of a better word, say weird or cutting edge? Is there going to be any device manipulation involved? Is there going to be any shaking or tilting or vibration, haptics, where a mobile device, drag and drop is really common device manipulation? Think about those things in the requirements phase, because if you've got those things, you need to build an accessible equivalent into the product. And if you forget about it, and then you get to the end, you're talking about a pretty big miss, because either the product is going to be released without it, which may end up causing, backlash and brand damage and things like that, or you're going to have to delay the release date to go back and build in an equivalent path. Okay, accessibility definition of done. It's absolutely critical that it's called out. For those of you who are familiar with Agile or Kanban, you want to make sure that all of your tickets have accessibility reflected in the requirements, so that the tickets cannot be closed until the individual who owns the ticket has proven that their work is accessible. So that is critical to shifting left accessibility back to the requirements analysis. So now let's look at feasibility studies, which is the next ring out from requirements analysis. So when you're doing a feasibility study, typically you have a prototype and you're getting it in front of your users. So you might recruit a user that fits your persona. You have that grad student who just came over from that other university. You might want to get them in front of an early version of the software and get their feedback. So it's really important to have people with disabilities in your user research pool. If you haven't given your personas disabilities, which we talked about in the previous stage, it's a little bit harder to do it at this stage, but it's still doable. It's just a little bit harder. So, there are organizations that specialize in recruiting people with disabilities for user research studies. Just to name a few that I've worked with, this isn't intended to be an exhaustive list. Centers for Independent Living typically do this. Chapter houses for Lighthouse of the Blind. Nobility in Texas does a lot of user research. Fable in Canada does it as well. So you can find people outside of the US, you can find people in the US. Research is largely remote these days. It's rare for people to need to be in the same room. So if you're on a pretty strict budget, you can look at going to some lower cost resources outside of the US if you need to. But it's absolutely critical to have people with disabilities in your user research pool. We are 22% plus or minus, depending on what country you're in, somewhere between 16 and 22% of the population. And if you are not recruiting for that, you're not getting an adequate representation of your user pool, looking at these prototypes and giving you feedback. Okay, prototypes have to be accessible. Okay, if you put a prototype in front of me that doesn't work with a keyboard, I'm not going to be able to give you any feedback because I don't use a mouse. So we're getting better with design tools. where Figma and Miro in particular, I've been working with them for over a year now and been putting a pretty significant amount of pressure on them. They're getting better with accessibility. I think within a year, Figma prototypes will probably be screen reader accessible, and you won't actually have to have written code to do research with people with disabilities. But for right now, you need to make sure that your prototypes are accessible regardless of what platform it is that you're deploying your prototypes on. Okay, we talked about the consulting with the people with disability and assistive technology lived experience. If you didn't do it in the requirements phase, you can do it in the feasibility phase. Now, here's where it gets expensive. You may learn something in the feasibility stage that then makes you go back and change your requirements. And that gets into rework, and rework slows things down, and rework is expensive. So that's why it's important. Some of these things will show up multiple times. It's just the later that you do it in the product development cycle, the more expensive it's going to be for you to incorporate the feedback that you're getting and make the product more accessible at the end of the day. Okay, design phase. Design thinking sessions are very popular. They're also really super accessible. I've been to design thinking sessions where people want to write things down on Post-it notes and then go put them up on a whiteboard and move them around and stuff like that. And I couldn't even get my wheelchair to the whiteboard because of all the chairs in the way. So you need to think about physical accessibility. If it's an in-person session, you need to think about digital accessibility. If it's a Zoom session, a lot of popular design thinking tools such as Mentimeter and different voting platforms and word clouds are not accessible. So you need to have an alternate path for people with disabilities in order to get their feedback into the system. Okay, are the design tools accessible? Again, as I mentioned, Miro and Figma are definitely on a path to accessibility. Lots of other design tools are not. So when you choose design tools, try to choose something that's accessible so that you can have designers with disabilities involved with that design tool use and process. Okay, accessible design component libraries or design systems. So there's about, last time I checked, about 1,500 open source design systems that are totally free. You can just download them and use them. Of the 15, I think about 25 are accessible. So there's 1,475 design systems you need to be avoiding if you want your end product to be accessible. The reason is that if you get a design component and you can't make it accessible, that bug is going to show up in your end product every single time you use that component. If it's, for example, something in the footer that, if you've got 1,000 web pages, it's going to show up 1,000 times. So start with an accessible component library or design system, or build your own accessible design component library and design system. Lots of people do their own. You don't necessarily have to use somebody else's, but you need to make sure, for example, that whatever design system that you're using supports ARIA if you're building HTML, because otherwise you're not going to be able to use live region and described by and other features that take what's on the screen and leave it visually the same, but make it more accessible to people who are listening to the page rather than reading the page visually. Okay. Do the designers use design accessibility checklists? When you've got a program that's not particularly mature with respect to accessibility, checklists are a good way to make sure that things don't get missed. As the program gets more mature, people should have, I don't want to say memorized because that's not the right word, but they should be feeling the accessibility or the lack of accessibility as they're looking at a design. I mean, my 12-year-old daughter used to call out accessibility errors when she looked at my screen when I was working on the sofa. So it's not difficult for people to start integrate it into their way of thinking, but until it's integrated, checklists are a good fallback. Okay, and then accessibility briefs. Too many organizations do not do accessibility briefs. The design org goes, hey, developers, look, I'm done. Here are the comps. Thanks, I'm going to go work on this other project now. That is not a recipe for success, because there are too many things in the design that aren't visual that need to be coded in a particular way to be accessible. You might need certain headings. You might need certain page titles. You might need, it might need to be pointed out to the developer, hey, when you're doing this shopping cart thing and somebody adds something to the shopping cart, you have to tell them that the subtotal updated, you have to tell them that the delivery updated, you have to tell them that this coupon updated. So conveying things that can't visually be seen on the comp to the developers is pretty critical, because otherwise you're going to get what you handed off, which is just what's visual, and that's never sufficient. So I call these things accessibility briefs. And so it would include things like the designer saying, hey, you know what, this link that says click here, announce via ARIA, click here to learn more about our training next week on, whatever, making documents accessible. So that you make sure that you're getting what's accessible at the end of the day and not what's just implied to be accessible. The belt and suspenders approach. It means that the designers are not relying on the fact that the developers understand accessibility. The designers tell the developers what to do. They give them the comp files and the design files, which shows them visually what it's supposed to look like. And then the developers go off and they code it, hopefully in an accessible manner. Okay, development phase. One thing that's really critical, and one of the reasons why I was invited to give this talk, is VMware has successfully integrated Wave into our CI/CD pipeline. And CI/CD stands for continuous integration, continuous delivery. It means it's for SaaS, software as a service, anything that runs in the cloud. SaaS is very different from the old-fashioned style of software releases that we used to do even 5 or 6 years ago. It's not even been a decade, because those software in the old day, you would do a major release and maybe you would do a couple of minor releases a year, but they were big and they were monolithic and there was a big splash and it was like, boom, here it is. SaaS, you can update anytime you want, any number of times. We have stuff at VMware where we update a couple hundred times a week. By building the tests in to the pipeline, what you can do is you can reject code where new tests are failing, new accessibility tests are failing that were previously passing. And what that does is that prevents regression. That prevents the progression of the software or the bug not being found into later stages like testing and production. You're finding the bug in development. Yeah, it's still a bug. Yeah, you still gotta spend a certain amount of money to fix it, but it's a heck of a lot better than finding it when the accessibility testers find it or when the customer finds it. It's vastly more expensive in those later stages. And then everything that isn't accessible requires an alternate accessibility path. And I think somebody is talking about this later today about data visualization. This is something that we're investing a lot of resources in at VMware right now, how to make our data visualizations completely accessible. Progress bars are another common one that are very tricky to make accessible within the progress bar itself. So it's actually better to have a different path to the same data that the user would have gotten if the progress bar is accessible. And these are things that you can find out or plan for in the requirements phase, but you got to make sure you do it in the development phase. It's a feature that you can't drop to make the release date, because then what you're going to have isn't going to be an equal experience. Okay, so by the time you get to testing, so we're on phase 4 here. If you've done your shift left work correctly, you've been running those automated tests all the time with every single check-in in your development cycle. What does that mean? That means that your testers don't have to run the automated tests, or maybe they run them once just to confirm the results. They don't have to run them repeatedly because they're being done in the earlier phase. And that means that accessibility testers can then focus on manual testing and assistive technology use. You always want to make sure that your accessibility tickets and your functional tickets are in the same backlog. If you don't do that, accessibility tickets tend to be considered a second-class citizen and never make it out of the backlog to be fixed. So definitely do not segregate your backlogs. That is a recipe for failure. Another recipe for failure is overlapping accessibility testing and functional testing. You can overlap it some, like maybe 25%. I've got this great meme that shows this NASCAR, 19-car crash. That's what happens when you overlap them identically, because when you do functional testing, you're looking for bugs that everybody will see. And then you change the code, and that invalidates any accessibility testing you've done. Same thing the other way. Your accessibility testing, when those bugs get fixed, you may introduce a new functional bug. So it's very important not to overlap these two. You can overlap them a little bit, but you definitely don't want to overlap them more than 25%. And another thing is random sampling is really, really important. If you've got a website that's got, let's say 2,000 pages, I'm just going to pick that as a random number. You're not going to be able to manually test all 2,000 pages. So what do? You take a sitemap, okay? Which sitemaps are essential to random sampling. You use a random number generator, and you say, okay, I want to test 70 of these pages, and the random number generator will spit out 70 numbers, and you map those to the sitemap. You load your sitemap into an Excel file, and if your random number generator spits out 74, you go to row 74, that page gets tested. When the random number generator says 119, you go to 119, that's what gets tested. You will find more errors in random sampling than you will on focused testing. Now, focused testing is still important also. You want to look at all your high traffic pages, because that's, even if there's a small bug, that's where it's going to be the most noticeable, because that's going to be where the most eyes are. But random sampling is a really important part of the shift left process, because it will allow you to find bugs that you might not otherwise find until the customers start using the product. How am I doing for time? I'm gonna check my, yeah, I'm actually okay. All right, deployment phase. Accessible customer support, really important. You don't need to be as fancy and as full-blown as using Be My Eyes or Ira or the Microsoft Disability Answers Desk, but you do need to have at least one customer support person trained on how to do intake when you get a customer with a disability who's calling, who uses assistive technology, because otherwise they're just going to get handed off, the customer will, all over the place, and that makes for a very bad customer experience that they then may go public with. Okay, do you test content changes in production? Most web pages have content that's updatable, and it's updatable by people who were not involved with the creation of the initial content. Some organizations have content management teams that are separate from the whole coding and initial content process. Some companies use third-party organizations to maintain like ads and news streams, and to make sure that the content is always, fresh and aligned with other things that are going on. But you need to test those changes because you can have a perfectly accessible infrastructure and perfectly accessible content, and you roll that out, and somebody with a, low level of education updates the content and breaks it, your page is now, that you've invested a lot of time and energy in making accessible, is now inaccessible. So testing content changes in production, very important as part of the shift left methodology, because hopefully if issues did get introduced, they will find them here before the customers find them. Because remember, the goal is finding it and fixing it before the customer finds it, and then finding it and fixing it as early as possible, or preventing it, so that you're doing that cheaper. Making sure your third parties know how to check for accessibility before pushing updates to production. That's really important. SaaS, for cloud-based environments, you have to have a staging environment to test before that code is pushed to production. Remember, you're doing, somewhere between, maybe on the low end, a dozen, and on the high end, a couple hundred code updates a week. And so you need to have that somewhere that somebody can look at before it goes out to the customers to be seen. So happy to answer questions now. Did you want to handle reading those out?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, you're welcome to go through them as well, whatever makes sense. So I'll just read a few here. So can you speak to how you make prototypes accessible in the teams you have worked with?
So making prototypes accessible is pretty much the same as making anything else accessible. It's just that you need to make sure that it works with the screen reader and a keyboard and magnification before you get a person with a disability who's a user in front of it. So the process itself isn't any different. It's just doing it earlier than most people are doing it today.
Awesome. And there was a question, I loved what you shared about, personas and including disabilities in that. And there was a question that's even like, well, if we're not even using personas at all in the first place, like how do we get kind of that adopted?
Well, if you're not using personas in the first place, then the question is, how the hell do you know what your users want? So personas are pretty important because you are there to solve a problem for the user. And if you don't know what your users want, the chances of you hitting the target when you don't know what you're aiming at aren't very high. So organizations that don't use personas typically don't talk to users enough. They make assumptions about what the users want. And, sometimes they're right, lots of times they're wrong. So you can kind of pare down the cost of doing something wrong. You may implement a feature and people are like, well, we didn't want this feature. Well, it doesn't matter how cool you think the feature is if the user doesn't want it. So I would say start with your user research first. Everything starts with user research, to be honest with you. Start with your user research first, then build your personas from there, then give them disability.
Awesome. So there's another question from Fergus on random sampling versus high volume pages. I did love the idea of random sampling. The question though is, should high volume take priority? Like which one do you do as your priority? The random sampling versus high volume?
I usually interleave. The problem is by saying that one is more important than the other, you're implying that if you draw a line in the sand and say, we're not testing anymore because we ran out of time, that most of your random sampling is the stuff that's going to be left on the floor. So I'll usually start with like maybe the 10 highest volume pages, and then go into the random sampling, and then go back and forth. Go, okay, now we're going to look at the next 10 high volume pages, and then we're going to do a little bit more random sampling, and kind of go back and forth that way. That way they get slightly more equivalent treatment. The high volume is a little bit more important, only because, as I mentioned, even small problems that show up on high volume pages, everybody's going to see them because they're high volume pages. That's where people are going. But the other problems are important too. And sometimes the other problems with random sampling will turn up patterns of issues where if you fix it in one place, it solves the problem in a lot of locations. And so that's one of the reasons why random sampling is important.
Awesome. There was a question if you could potentially go back to that deployment phase slide.
Deployment.
Phase slide. Yeah.
This one?
Yes, I believe that is it. So somebody said there's just awesome content on there and they want to take a look at it again.
Oh, okay.
So while I'm asking them,
I'm happy to give people a copy of this. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'll just shoot you a copy of the deck.
Awesome. And that was a common question as well, so appreciate it. So there's a question on how you account for cognitive accessibility in the design and development cycle.
So it's actually easier to do other types of disabilities, right? You can simulate the inability to use a mouse by making a designer use a keyboard for the entire day. You want to see a designer implode, make them use a keyboard only for an hour. That's always a fun experience. The problem is you can't simulate neurodiversity. You can't put earplugs in, you can't put a blindfold on, and I don't even believe in those for empathy exercises, but I'm just saying you can kind of sort of simulate them. There's no way to simulate neurodiversity. You cannot do cognitive disability work, dyslexia work, autism work without having people who are experiencing those conditions contributing, and preferably lots of them, because no two disabilities, even if you have the exact diagnosis, are identical. My daughter has a profound level of hearing loss in one ear, and she's got about half of her hearing off in the other ear, and she's worn hearing devices since she was a child. Okay, she actually doesn't consider herself disabled. If somebody woke on this call today with quote unquote normal hearing, woke up with her level of hearing loss someday because they developed Meniere's disease or had a viral infection or something, meningitis, trust me, they would consider themselves disabled. So it's the exact same medical condition, but because of the length and the time where people have been able to develop compensatory skills and integrate the disability into their identity, a completely different approach to how they think about it and how they handle it. So you want as many people as possible so that you cover as many of the aspects of dyslexia as you can, and as many of the aspects of cognitive with short-term and long-term memory issues are obviously completely different as well. So hopefully I answered that question. If I didn't, if I don't get to your question, you can ping me on LinkedIn. If you wanted more, or I didn't quite understand what you said, ping me on LinkedIn. I pretty much live on LinkedIn. Somebody asked about accessible component libraries. Yeah, I've actually got a list. If you, again, ping me on LinkedIn, I can send you the slide from the deck with links to the 24 or so that I know about. VMware uses something called Clarity, which we've built in-house. Google has Material, GE has Spectrum, Salesforce has Lightning. There's some industry specialized stuff. There's some special ones for government. There's some special ones for universities. What are they called? Shopify has an accessible design system. Recommendation on which to test first, last, functional or accessibility? Absolutely, functional first. It's the same reason for high volume versus random sampling. If you have functional bugs in your products, your accessibility team isn't going to be able to find the accessibility problems because they're not going to be able to get past the functional problems. So functional definitely comes first, and then about 75% of the way through functional, depending on how bad the testing, how many problems the testing has turned up, is usually the time where I think about cutting over to accessibility testing. General percentage of issues that can be found automated and manual. Well, you know, the standard number that's thrown out there is 3070. VMware has put a lot of effort, and we're just about to issue our first update into doing machine learning augmentation to Wave. And we believe that by the end of 2023, so in about 15 months plus or minus, we can get that number closer to 50-50. So we did a release of a tool into open source called Crest, because what happens when waves are done? They crest. So we run Wave first, and then we run Crest. And we have a test harness in-house, which VMware has also released into the open source. And it's just one button push. You push the button and it runs Wave and Crest for you, and then gives you one single integrated set of results, so that we're not making the developers do extra work, because we all know how much developers love to do extra work. They get one set of accessibility results in one format that reflects the output of both sets of testing that got done behind the scenes. And it's in GitHub. Just search for GitHub VMware Crest and you'll find it. When hiring somebody for an accessibility role, do you value IAAP and WASP certifications? Absolutely. You can't get a degree in accessibility, right? I can count on my fingers how many 4-credit college courses you can take on accessibility. So getting somebody with a submission with those certifications doesn't tell you how good you are, but it tells you at least they were good enough that they passed the exams and you know what's in the exam, right? Trusted tester is another one. I tell everybody who's overseas, you have to do trusted tester. I actually tell them, and I'm gonna get shot by IAAP for saying this, I actually tell people overseas to do trusted tester first, because it's free. And because it says, when you've got that certificate saying you've finished it, I know how to test to the American standards for accessibility. So, you know, a lot of people, $375 or whatever the price is for the certification is just more than they can afford. If you can't do that, then go trusted tester. But yes, get some kind of certification, because that proves at a minimum what it is that you know. To be able to walk through including accessibility in your definition of done, I would probably need another hour to talk about that. Maybe that would be another webinar I should do. Where do I think accessibility should fit in the MVP definition? Well, you know, the question is, does your company want to claim that they're inclusive? Right? Either you're doing it because you have to do it because you got money from the federal or from the state government, or you're doing it because your customers want it, or you're doing it because your company wants to claim that they're inclusive. If you want to claim that you're inclusive, you cannot leave disability out of the equation. So, you know, we have a separate segment for every epic. That's an Atlassian term for those of you who aren't familiar with JIRA, J-I-R-A, JIRA. That the tickets can't get closed until the person has put in, this is what we did to make sure that this was accessible. Large organizations without a lot of these shift left practices, what 1 or 2 starting points would you consider to be the highest leverage place to start, particularly from a perspective of gaining internal momentum, shifting mindsets of stakeholders who aren't thinking in terms of accessibility? I think the most important thing to start with when you're talking about changing the hearts and minds of leadership, which is, I think, what you're referring to, that the most important thing to start with is to make sure that executives get exposed to people using assistive technology. So have a global accessibility awareness week where you bring in people who show how they use assistive technology. It's really a mind-opening experience for executives that think of disabilities or people with disabilities as somehow less than people without disabilities. And when they see somebody who's blind executing and interpreting a Google query faster than a sighted person, it really gives them a different perspective on what people with disabilities can do if companies don't block them from doing it by releasing inaccessible products. So I would say if you were going to do one thing, that would be it. That would be my starting point. And then maybe the personas with disabilities, because if you pick one of the early ones, then it's going to carry all the way through and influence other things in later cycles. Can Sheri show the myth page again? Sure. I can also send you the deck. Got to go back a little bit for myths. Myth. There you go. Best way to recruit and engage people with disabilities in design and code reviews, pay them. That's not rocket science. You are not doing the right thing if you are expecting people with disabilities to provide their expertise for free, right? They don't want Amazon gift cards. They want to be paid just like everybody else. Now, there may be limits if they are actually receiving disability payments to what they can receive, but work it out with them. In terms of recruiting, I rattled off the name of a bunch of agencies who can do the recruiting for you, or you can recruit yourself by doing things with the National Association of Disability, or any of the organizations that focus on hearing loss or blindness. They usually have pools of people that you can draw from for your user research, but the answer is you have to pay them. Content management teams and testing accessibility in production. So if you're using, it's different if you're using an outside contractor than if you're using an internal people. If you're using an outside agency to manage your content, you need to put in your contract that they are responsible for making sure that it's WCAG 2.1 level AA compliant, and that if things are reported to them, that they've got a finite period of time to fix the bugs. Because at the end of the day, if somebody sues you, they're going to sue you, and you might have an okay counterclaim against your content management company if it was required under contract that it be accessible and they screwed it up. But you don't want a good counterclaim. What you want is for it to be right. So the best way to make sure that it's right is to have it in the contract and have it all spelled out. For internal people, we've actually altered some of our content management systems, for example. So now they can't upload videos without uploading a transcript file. It's mandatory. Or they can't upload they can't upload images without alt text. So those are some things that you can do to try to prevent problems cropping up with content updates. Recommendations for automated mobile app testing tools. I have to be careful when I say I use this or I use that. I don't mind saying I use Wave because we've been using it for years and we have a great relationship with the University of Utah. There is one mobile app testing tool that I'm looking at right now. And there's the one that's been out for a while, I think, from DQ. And those really are the only super good ones that I'm aware of. A lot of mobile app testing just has to be done manually. It's a more manual process than just testing desktop web pages. Will Trusted Tester help you prepare for the CPAC? Now, they're two completely different tests. CPAC is more about, it's not about testing. Let me just put it that way. Trusted Tester is 100% about testing. CPAC is almost everything but testing. You know, do you understand what the needs of people with epilepsy are? Do you understand where accessibility is integrated into inclusive design? I don't think I'm giving away any secrets here when I mention those as a couple of examples. So Trusted Tester will help you prepare for CPAC to the extent that it will give you more exposure to disabilities in general, but the two focuses are very different. Also, Trusted Tester, like I said, it's free. It is an investment of time. It took me more than 100 hours to finish the Trusted Tester program, and I had been in accessibility for 8 years at that point when I did it. So I'm probably going to be running over my time soon.
And maybe answer one more question, Sheri, and then, but this is awesome.
Is there a robust tool that scans sites behind a password so VMware testing as a service, the Selenium-based test harness that we released into the open source has record and feedback, which includes putting in passwords. One name for accessible prototypes, Figma. The other one was Miro, M-I-R-O. So there I snuck into.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sheri. We really appreciate it. That was awesome. I learned a lot. And judging by all the questions and everything, so did everyone else. We really appreciate it.
I always determine the success or failure of my presentations by the questions I get. And if I run out of time answering questions, that usually means it was a good presentation. So thank you for all the thoughtful questions.